Hello and welcome to my honors thesis project. My name is Julian Haywood, and you're going to be watching an interview between my dad and I. The interview was actually inspired by conversations I've had with my father over the years, and it actually inspired my whole honors thesis project. That being said, I'll be honest, when I was originally planning this project, I planned on interviewing a bunch of people and getting a bunch of different perspectives on the black experience, and more specifically, when it comes to tracking our ancestry. But I really enjoyed the interview I had with my dad, and I didn't really want to cut it up or shorten it by any means. And so you're actually just going to watch the whole interview, relatively unedited. Actually, the only edits that are there are going to be me kind of hopping in to provide some context. We're going to cover a bunch of different topics, and we had a more natural flow of, and we use the word interview, but honestly, it's more just of a conversation between a father and son on the topics of maybe what it means to be black and specifically here in America and what it means for our ancestry, our family, and so you get a lot of interesting details, and I hope that you enjoy it.
Okay, I didn't think of how to start a conversation, right? But I figured, I remember when we were kids reading books, and as we go into school, I would come home and I'd ask you "Hey Dad, what are we?" Or reading books on Native Americans and such, and learning about their tribes, and I feel like it instilled a desire for me to know where we come from and what we are. So I'm not sure how often it happens to you, but when you're out and people ask you, what are you or what's your ethnic background, what do you tell them?
I say African American, but I don't have that many people come up to me and ask me that kind of stuff. I mean, I think you can see,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
so
Not really called into question too much, right?
no.
Okay, and so, and do you say African American, and when do you say black if you say you're black?
I don't say black, I say African
You say
American.
African American.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and then growing up and with Mama Gwen and such, did you have conversations with her about our ethnic background and our history at all?
I didn't,
Mm-hmm.
at my age, that wasn't on my mind. Maybe my brothers and sisters did, but I didn't have those type of conversations. I knew our family was from Florida.
From Florida.
I heard that there was a Native American in our family in Florida, but I couldn't tell you.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. And but now across your life, have you thought about that? I know we've had conversations about it in the past before. Have you done anything to research into it? Whether that be talking to family, I know, with our cousins down in Florida, you've had conversations with them, or do you try to look it up online, or?
No, I've never really looked at it online or had any interest in it. It wasn't something that was on the forefront of my mind until you started talking about it more. And even then, it made me think about my father's side of the family because I don't have that big of an idea of how far that goes.
Right.
So I don't know if I'm open to doing like the 23andMe or whatever those things are, but it made me think that maybe we need to look at that side of the family a little deeper to see, could be more.
Right, right. And where do you feel like your hesitation comes from when it comes to those mail-in genetics?
Yeah, sending your genetics and your genes through the mail, through saliva,
Right.
and you never know what happens with that afterwards.
Right.
You could do all kind of things with that kind of information, or I guess it's your DNA.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And as we have conversated about it, obviously talked to TT Steph. You said you maybe compared to her, some of your other family members, it's not really been something too much on your mind, or that you don't think about enough to pursue.
Mm-hmm.
What do you feel like maybe you think about more when it comes to your identity? Do you feel like your heritage that far back is an important part of your identity?
No, I don't think. I think it starts from probably my father to me to you guys,
Right.
as important as the past to a degree. That's how I've always looked at it. Not saying that's a great way to look at it, but the past, because that side of the family is so small, you kind of think it ended, with me until I had you guys.
Right.
And now it will go on.
Yeah.
The Haywood last name, but it is interesting to know what that last name means.
Right.
And Maybe I will in the future.
Maybe more interested in as far as like when we were, when our family line came to America or was brought to America. So would you say maybe you're more interested in tracking that as opposed to all the way back to Africa? Or
Oh yeah, most definitely be more interested in finding out the Haywood last name, where they come from, and how far it went back.
right,
You know. Now, if it took us to
a
go in,
specific,
yeah, then I
country
would
or-
do that.
right,
But I'd be interested to see what it is in the form now
right,
from my father, his mother and father, and who are their mother and father.
because I know like we were doing the math on like our maternal line, and how far back that would go to, like potentially living as a slave, right? And I think or with me, I think 4, maybe 5 generations removed from that. And so, do you feel like you're maybe bothered, or maybe bothered's not the right word for it, but do you ever feel like negative emotions or feelings toward how difficult it might be to track as opposed to maybe other cultural groups?
No, no. At a point, you got to get over what was the past, and you build towards a future, and that's what I've always looked at. You know, it may be hard to figure out how far we go back, but we've known that.
Mm-hmm.
So where do we go from now?
Right.
From then, you know, do you go as far as you can, and then what? You still building forward,
Right.
you know, and you build off the backs of your people before that.
And do you feel like, because as we've traveled, do you feel around the states as far as like down south, and then we were talking about Minnesota and the different diverse groups there, do you feel there's a connection, obviously between maybe African Americans, but do you feel a connection per se to other groups from the diaspora?
No.
Mm-hmm.
No, I mean, I don't feel that way. I feel it more with my family in Florida, you know, and what they talk about their life was. And their life really goes back to, I don't know if I say this, but, you know, the drug scene,
Right.
you know, the crack era.
Yeah.
The time period that my dad is referring to here at this part of the video is what was known as the crack epidemic of the 80s and 90s. It is a time period that saw an increase in the circulation of crack cocaine, which was a solid smokable form of cocaine that was easy to produce and could be sold in smaller quantities. It was ready to use and it was highly profitable for dealers, and so it found its way into the lower income inner city communities. And this negatively impacted the African American community or the black community because that is the communities where they lived in. And during that time period, as well in the following years, there were spikes in the homicide rate, a rise in instances of negative birth defects, as well as fetal deaths, as well as an increase of arrest and incarceration rates in the African American community. On top of that, the U.S. Congress passed laws that created a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity for the possession of and trafficking of cocaine and crack when compared to penalties for the powder version of cocaine. For example, an individual carrying 50 grams of crack cocaine would receive a minimum of 10 years of a 10-year penalty, whereas to receive the same 10-year minimum penalty, someone would have to be carrying 5,000 grams of powder cocaine. And this type of discriminatory policy negatively impacted the African American community as well as other minority communities and caused a lot of split families, which again is more relevant to the topic the conversation we're having here.
Yeah.
That interests me how that tore our family up more than anything else, you know, because so you don't make the same mistakes.
Right. Because to a certain degree, what you say, and you spoke about moving forward and moving on. Slavery is obviously in the past, and so I mean that type of crack era per se, but it's had a much more maybe recent effect on our family as opposed to maybe slavery. So do you feel like maybe that's why you're more interested?
Well, definitely that, and unless reparations are being talked about and having to prove it, how far do you go back?
Right.
You know, but we know in the 80s what happened.
Mm-hmm. I saw that.
You know, and how it tore up a family.
Right.
Or, you know, made, you know, that's just my viewpoint of it from a distance.
Yeah.
Maybe TT Steph will have something a little different. If you went deeper into the family who actually lived it,
Right.
you would see, they would have a different viewpoint because they lived it. I lived it from I saw it from a distance,
Right.
and really then didn't even connect to it.
Yeah, it's interesting. I never really, I don't know, in my mind I always think like, oh, we got to get back to not Africa per se, like us physically move there, but I feel like I at least personally desire a knowledge, a connection with that. I'm curious to how much like culture we've lost per se with that happening, but I've never really considered how something so localized maybe to our community as the African American community when it comes to crack or the drug use and that epidemic kind of impacted our family. Do you feel like maybe would you be interested to know, like, if you found out you were from Nigeria, do you think maybe you would adopt more those aspects of that country or that cultural group into your daily life?
No, I think that I'm a little different. So I think if I found that out and all of a sudden I tried to live my life like that, that I'd be fronting.
You'd be fine.
Yeah, or I'd be faking. And I think it would be something good to know. And if that history took it to knowing that we owned land in Nigeria,
Right.
or this or that, or something like that, or there were kings, that would be good to know. But even then, I'd like to know how that would affect my day-to-day life, unless I decide to move there. If I decide, if they said, okay, if you're from here, you get land and you
Citizenship or
can citizenship,
something like
then that kind of thing would probably get me interested.
The conversation that we're having here on citizenship is one we'll also touch on later in the interview. But essentially, it's something I've researched myself, looking for avenues for African Americans to get citizenship back in countries in Africa. And I found essentially two routes, one being the route of citizenship by descent, and then the other being the citizenship by ancestry. And the terms seem to be used interchangeably. I'll be honest, when I was looking through, I could not find very many options that were for African Americans specifically. There are other countries outside of Africa who offer some type of citizenship by ancestry or by descent, and that's if you can find a way to prove a direct line to their country. For example, countries like France, countries like Italy, countries like Scotland in Europe, more specifically, were the ones that I found offer some type of citizenship back to their countries if you can tie your family ties back there. And then obviously that's an issue for African Americans because of the slave trade. It's very hard to track or to prove some type of ancestry back to a country specifically. Oftentimes when you do these tests, from what I've seen, you get regions, but again, to tie it back to a country would be very hard to prove, which limits the opportunities to apply for citizenship, whereas you might compare to other members of other communities, how they have a lot easier of a time proving their family's ancestry ties back to those countries. And essentially the conversation further on the importance of having the ability to pursue citizenship in another country is the opportunities that you might get would differ, obviously, between maybe here in America versus having the option to bring in investments and opportunities in business and the rights that you would have being a citizenship of another country. There have been African countries who are exploring programs and offering citizenship to members of the African American community back in their country. Through my research, I found programs like Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, Cape Verde have all explored some type of offering of citizenship to descendants of slaves who are still residing in America. And other celebrities have also explored and found ways to be offered citizenship, but there hasn't necessarily been one that you can just look up and apply to in a standardized process, which is something that we're referring to here in the video on the concept of applying for citizenship.
But
right. And going from like a more philosophical perspective, do you feel like do you believe in, like, and obviously the conversation on like generational trauma and mental health issues has become more of a conversation in the generation that I've been alive in, maybe, as opposed to when you were growing up. But do you feel like or do you think, maybe rather than feel, that slavery and now the crack epidemic and the situation that happened then has instilled a type of generational or maybe community trauma on like African Americans specifically.
Yeah, I think that as sad as it may be, as your elders die, you move away from that thought process. So not having great grandparents alive or grandparents alive, you move from that era. So the things that stick in your head are the things that, affect your family, affect how you live. So I think it is more important to understand where we're at in 2024. Maybe going back to, for you guys, the 90s.
Right.
What was the 90s like? You guys, late 90s being born, early 2000, and how life was, financing, cyberbullying,
Right.
all those things that, have changed people.
Right.
It's totally different now, you're right.
Yeah, and I think sometimes whether it be from because our people as African Americans have been resistant to so much, right? Or resisted and persevered, maybe is a better word for it, through so much. But I would be interested to think how much a connection back to an ancestral homeland, wherever that might be, and obviously, I mean, through the Atlantic slave trade, the waters are probably muddied as far as where specifically, but even if we could get a general vicinity or a general location or even a country, 2 countries, 3 countries, I wonder how much that would do to heal the trauma that our community has gone through. And maybe if we had a tie back to that was a more tangible, if it would.
I think maybe the United States acknowledgement of what slavery did to African Americans would be bigger than anything of what happened or where you come from. If you acknowledge that this country was built on the backs of slaves, not only black slaves, but, throughout the history, there's always been slaves in the United States
Right.
in some form. So you have to acknowledge that, and you acknowledge it like you did for Native Americans, the wrong were done
Right.
for them. The Holocaust,
Right.
the Jewish community got things, but
Obviously, the conversation on reparations is quite a complex one, and obviously as well a sensitive one. But essentially, I just wanted to give some context to what my father's referring to here. He's talking about the reparations that were paid by Germany to Israel for the wrongdoings and the atrocities committed during the Holocaust. And there's also a very strong and obvious and outright acknowledgement of the wrongdoings of the Holocaust towards the Jewish community and obviously the other members of communities that were affected by the Holocaust in Germany. I can speak to a personal experience when I went to go visit Germany. We went into a restaurant, and the first lady we spoke to obviously noted that we were Americans and came up and told us that that they hate Hitler and that they love black people and that they love Jews, and they're not the Germany that we see kind of in our history books and in our movies depicting that past era. And so there's a very obvious public and government acknowledgement of those wrongdoings, and then even referring to the acknowledgement of the wrongdoings of America towards the Native Americans, or the American government towards the Native Americans. And obviously one could question whether or not it equals out, or it's enough or appropriate, or whether or not it equates to reparations, what America has done for the Native American communities. But through a quick Google search, you can find different type of reparations, whether they be cash reparations or tax incentives given to Native American tribes. Again, one can argue, and will probably have a point, that it's nowhere near equaling out what was done to them as far as land and the situation that the Native American community finds itself in now. But we do see a distinct lack of acknowledgement from the U.S. government as a whole, and consistent acknowledgement from the U.S. government as a whole when it comes to slavery and what type of recourse can be taken. And obviously, if you pay attention to the news, you'll see many reports on whether or not we're still going to educate people on the events of slavery and the consequences of that, as well as whether or not we will even acknowledge it, and to what degree and how we teach it, are all the conversations that are happening. So that's kind of the context of the reparations conversation that I've had with my father before and here in this interview.
It's amazing, you know, the children, or what is the saying, the children of slaves
Right.
will never get just what they're supposed to.
Right. Right.
You know, so like the line of going back, I think it's cool if you can find something out. I mean, look at last night, the fight we watched between Anthony Joshua
Right.
and Francis.
Right.
You know, he lost, but you know, there's a lot of people have show pride in him making it that far, what he went through.
Right.
But I don't know if there's a connection. You know, the people always ask, is there a connection between European blacks and
Right.
American blacks?
Right.
What do you think about that in the context of slavery?
Right. Yeah. And when I was traveling over in Europe and I was interacting with them, I always thought, I don't want to say I always thought, not until then did I really feel almost like I missed out in a way, or like I was missing out on something, because I'm meeting them and I'm talking to them and they're like, oh, and I asked them, oh, like, well, you know, where are you guys from? And they're like, oh, you know, I'm from Ghana, or I'm from Nigeria, but you know, they were born and raised in Britain, or in the UK, and so and then when they ask me like, oh, where are you from, or you know, where does your family come from, I just tell them, you know, we're black, we're from Las Vegas, right, Nevada. My mom's from New York, and so I always wish that, or since then, and I saw like they go back to Africa every year, and they're not going back to Africa as almost tourists like we would. They're
going home.
They're going home.
Yeah.
Right. They're going home to their grandparents who got land there. They feel safe. They feel comfortable. They feel like they know how to navigate.
Right.
And so that, I feel like, caused me to feel like, dang, I kind of wish I had that. And that's not to say maybe I don't feel that way with African Americans. And I feel like, to speak to your conversation on like pride as like a community, like when you watch the Olympics and you watch like the U.S. men's basketball team, which is largely African American, right, or any of our African American athletes in this conversation of like athletics, I do feel maybe some sense of pride there, but I guess maybe not in the same way that, you know, all of Nigeria might feel for like a Nigerian athlete who gets
Right.
there. So
Well, that comes in a lot of different forms, because the reality is that when you travel abroad and these guys and girls are, you know, going back home to meet their family, for us, we don't have that period as American blacks. So for us to go home would be to go to Florida.
right,
To be around, and even then, we're going in the age group of the people that we may be running across are in their 60s,
right,
not their 80s.
Yeah.
So, you know, we missed that aspect. Well, you guys did. I got it late, like, you know, 10. We used to go visit my grandmother, you know, in Florida, but we were in Nevada most of our time when I was born. But Mike and Steph grew up in Florida with their aunties, you know, their uncles, and knew who they were.
Yeah.
And grandma was still alive. She was cooking. She was telling those stories. You know, we missed out on that. You guys get it with your grandmother now, but you don't get it to a degree from my side of the family.
Right.
Because nobody is alive from that, you know. And I think they do. I think it's a hard situation when African Americans, black, whatever you want to call people. This probably needs to be edited out, but you don't know who you're dealing with. Because I know that when I was in Italy and I came across European blacks, we were kind of like standoffish with each other.
right,
It was like, but it was like, these are black folks too.
Right.
But I didn't feel a kindred with them because I felt the difference between us.
right.
From my shoes to what I was wearing,
Right.
you know, and we would look at each other like that,
Right.
you know.
And that's interesting, because when I was out there, I felt that way maybe with like you know, people talk about like how you have that immediate understanding if like you're a black man in America, or you're both black men from America, whether it be the head nod, you know, the how you doing, whatever, or even just sometimes with the look. If I didn't get that in return, I felt like I knew you weren't African American, or at least maybe there wasn't that same type of connection. So I do feel you on that, but like
I figured now would be a good opportunity to kind of explore exactly what I mean by that and go into a little bit more detail on the acknowledgement between African Americans or black people out in public. So typically when you're walking by or you see another black person, you do some type of acknowledgement, whether that be a head nod, a simple greeting, even that acknowledgement can be communicated just through eye contact. A sort of like unspoken understanding, a mutual understanding. Hey, I see you, you see me. Almost like an I got you situation. Even like some might even argue like or say or describe it rather as like a small tinge of just mutual trust that goes in and is communicated through that acknowledgement of a head nod or a simple greeting. And I noticed that when I was traveling, that was less likely to happen. Speaking to a personal experience as I was walking through, I believe it was Ireland or Scotland, through the like downtown kind of touristy area, there was a black guy walking towards me, and as we got closer, I looked him in the eye, gave him a head nod, and he kind of looked at me puzzled and kind of face forward and kept going. And that was just a reminder to me that not everybody has that mutual understanding, and I'm sure that there are other forms of this amongst other communities, but especially as black people, speaking from my experience, it gives you a sense of like warmth, and at least to me, and comfort, knowing that there's going to be some type of acknowledgement there, and that feeling is kind of hard to describe, but that's what we're referring to here, and that doesn't always happen. I imagine that it's something we definitely do here in America amongst our black community. But I imagine that has a lot to do with the fact that we're a minority group, and in many spaces outside of places with high black populations, you're often a minority in rooms and classrooms and in school, walking through shopping stores and department areas. So that it may not be as common or even relevant in countries like on the continent of Africa, as well as in other areas where you just don't see very many of us, and people don't maybe necessarily learn and pick up on that. But it was what we're referring to here at this point.
On that, but like on the same note, when I was there, I was interacting with them. My friends there in the UK who were all black, you know, coming from different countries. At the same time, I felt like I was missing out, but I didn't feel like I was being ostracized or I was being pushed away. So I thought that was cool. And I think like if we were to, because I know sometimes there's the conversation on like, African Americans versus like Africans. And just like, you know, maybe some not bad blood, but so like not that that feeling of kinship like you mentioned.
Right.
And I think like if we could get past that, whether or not that be through a tie in our way back, or probably shouldn't need to, right?
Right.
We shouldn't have to have a tie back there. Just knowing that we come from the same continent should be enough, you think, to have that feeling.
But if we go to Africa tomorrow and we pull up there, I don't know how they would feel about us saying, "Oh, our American brothers came back,"
Right.
you know, to see where they're from.
Right.
You know,
Yeah.
like I don't know what that would, if it would look like that.
Yeah, I might hesitate to think that too.
You know what I mean? I think it would be you're tourist, and unless we were coming there with proof
Right.
and what the objective was, and it should be that way.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean? We do it to them here.
Right. That's true.
You know, when people come here to America, and here's another thing you got to think about. Coast. West Coast people are totally different than
Right.
East Coast, South, you know, and how they deal with each other.
Yeah.
You know, I see more love in our community in the South than I do on the West Coast when we deal with each other.
Right.
It's gotten worse in different areas
Yeah.
with gang violence and stuff like that, but, you know, everybody says, you know, when we were kings, you know, we should act like kings, but I don't think our group really knows that,
Well, yeah.
knows why they should be that.
Right. Or what it feels like, and
Right.
maybe that's where that comes that comes from, like you said, maybe more so than the tie back, but that next immediate living ancestor past your grandparents, maybe,
Right.
or even if it is your grandparents, because obviously you lost your parents when you were young, so I never got to meet my paternal grandparents.
Right.
And so, like you said, all those stories, all that history, not maybe what she's lived, but what she knows from her grandmother is probably, I don't want to say just as valuable or more valuable, but it's definitely just as valuable. What's lost in that? And like speaking to like going back to Africa, I know like when I was back in Morocco, I felt like when I walked through the what do they call it, the visa guy, or when you're doing customs, the security guard at customs told me welcome home, brother, and that felt good. And so I do know that there are going to be people out there, but I wonder, like you said, as a large community, if there are obvious differences, right, in experience and in culture and in life, but I would be curious if we were to maybe lower down the arms, right, so to speak, and the defenses, what might come from that.
Yeah, I think you'll be the start of that, probably for our family. Maybe you do the 23andMe. You know what I mean?
What you just saw there was some hesitation on both my part and my dad's part towards the idea of taking an ancestry test. Now, within the Black community, people take ancestry tests all the time, but there are quite a bit of people who kind of hesitate around it, and they hesitate for a few different reasons. What you just saw there was a hesitation towards the idea of sending your DNA off to some lab somewhere, and ideally, in a perfect world, you would trust that these companies are going to look out for you, and there's nothing nefarious will go on with your DNA. But unfortunately, you can't trust it because we don't live in a perfect world. And as a matter of fact, we see plenty of times where there are data leaks and information leaks where your personal information and the data related to your DNA can be leaked and released and sold. And so we don't live in a world where we can necessarily trust that. And then speaking on my personal reason why I may not want to take a ancestry test is for moral reasons. I feel like the idea of, and I think that the idea that taking an ancestry test and paying a company in order to process and give you information in a situation where in any other circumstance, in a world where slavery didn't happen, it would be reasonable to assume that you would have that information readily available to you through either other records or through a living record through people. And so I don't want to take an ancestry test for that reason. And those are two of maybe the hesitations around the idea of taking an ancestry test.
Certain things that everybody does. I never tried to handicap you guys the way you should or shouldn't do just because I didn't do it. You know what I mean? I come from a generation that's a little different, and all I wanted to do, and my friends and I talk about, is not fail in our generation. I felt like there was a couple generations that failed me. With information, with helping, and I wanted to make sure, and my friends talked about that we wouldn't be a generation of failure to our kids and our age group. That's why at one point the lodge was very important to me. Doing the community service that we were doing in our community. But you get to a point where it's like, okay, now I have to take care of my community, which is my household. And hopefully, when you travel, I thought it was cool to go. America's so beautiful that, when I went to Minnesota, they have like the second or third amount of Muslims there. And you see cops that are wearing hijabs, and they're seeing Eritreans. You're seeing that connection to Africa in the United States. And I think that is very cool. But I wonder about us going there. Right. How long will we be able to go there and stay and adjust? Because it's a different world.
That's a good point. Yeah. Like how long would it take you to adjust and to feel comfortable?
You ask most people. You even ask. You ask 5 blacks, American blacks. If you had the money, $1 million, where would you go? I guarantee you probably 5 out of them wouldn't say Africa would be in their top 2 for whatever reason.
I might say higher. We might say eight out of 10.
Right.
If I were Ben, man.
Yeah, and then you wonder why, because they're a preconceived notion of what Africa is.
Yeah, I would think so.
Yeah.
I would think so.
Hmm.
I would think. And it's like, yeah, I can even tell you, like, obviously I see the videos and we watch the videos of people traveling around Africa, different parts, West Africa, East Africa, Central Africa, South Africa. But like, in my mind, I can tell you like the wealthiest quote unquote African country, or the easiest one for Americans to go live in. And maybe that's a part of it too, that getting maybe initiatives of building an understanding, because you know we have classes now on like African American history, you know, at least on the West, right, the coast, and in higher education we often have classes on that, but I don't know how many classes we have, or even if those African American or African history classes teach African history or teach that far back, because like we said, you know, as far as what I know about slavery or what I know about our people is it starts from slavery, right? And I wonder if
You need to go backwards then.
Right.
Yeah, you would have to go backwards. And I guess that 23andMe is where you start learning that stuff basically. But you'd have to track down your family name and go back to, you know, a little bit. But when you go to Africa, so you plan on going to Africa at some point?
Yeah. And I'd like to say like within the next 3 years. So I think it would be, I mean, Glenn, I just don't know, like, I think my hesitations too is how much of it's going to be a travel back along the slave trade route, right? And like going to see the ports that they left from, like the Door of No Return, I think it's called, and those like locations, and then how much time do you devote towards like obviously the trauma, the history, the bad history per se, versus like going back for like cultural enrichment, like learning, hey, this is what maybe we lost or what we were disconnected from.
Yeah, you got to go. That's why the trip got to be long enough for you to be able to do all that at
Right.
the same time. But then what do you do with that information once you come back? What does that do for you in 2025, 2026,
Right.
2027? You know that this port my family left from, or my people left from, and we came here, we stopped in, you know, Caribbean. There was stopovers there. You know, there's those books that I have, you know, The Secret Relationship Between Blacks and Jews, that talk about the slave trade.
Right.
And, you know, how it started, where it stopped at, you know, and I just don't know what it does for you in 2028 when you come back.
Yeah.
You know, you still come back unless you're going to live there.
Right. And then that's where you maybe invest in a family, invest in the future, property like you were talking about.
Way of life, and say, you know, I'm going to go back to what I think is, or where we come from.
Right. And it's interesting that you say, like, what does that do for you? Because I think back to, like, the civil rights movement or even black civil leaders, right? And I would be interested to hear, like, you know, because we have all these black leaders who lived during the same time, Malcolm X, MLK, or within generations of each other, right? Nelson Mandela, you know, I'm sure there were European that I can't think of off the top of my head, black leaders.
Jesse Jackson, who's the preacher, Reverend, I forgot his name. They just found out he was a rat, a snitch for the mob. He was a snitch. What's his name? The skinny one. He used to be the ambulance chaser. I'll get his name for you. But
Here he's referring to Al Sharpton, who in 1991 formed the National Action Network, which pushed for and promoted progressive policies, the most well-known one being affirmative action, as well as participated in the discussion around reparations for African American descendants of slaves.
name for you, but that was pretty disappointing to hear about him. But you were saying about the black leaders.
Yeah, I'm just so curious to think, like, because they were interacting with each other, writing essays or mail or letters to each other as they had their individual struggles, obviously, with like South Africa with apartheid, same with the civil rights movement, and then the rights issues in places like France, which are still having issues with obviously their colony or the countries that used to be their colonies. But like they interacted and they supported each other to some degree. Now, the tangibility of that support, right, further than just a letter,
Mm-hmm.
I would be interested to research too, because then it's like maybe they were onto something during a critical time in our people's history.
Well, there was, for every Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, there was a Patrice Lumumba. I don't know how to say his name, but then there was Marcus Garvey, the Back to Africa
Frederick
movement.
Douglass.
Frederick Douglass. You know, there was a Back to Africa movement that could have changed the way
Right.
we are today
And the scope
if
of-
people went back.
Right.
And that's something that you have to look at, because in that era, you wonder how many people would go back, or how many people did go back, and the people who didn't, why would they? What did they see in America that make you want to stay?
Right.
You know, you could leave tomorrow. Right now, it's different now. We can go get citizenship anywhere if we wanted to.
Right. Maybe to
If, you know, for the most part.
Right.
I don't know what Africa looks like, but you know, there's expats live in a lot of different places.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
And I think because W.E. Du Bois talks about like a sovereign human soul and like a desire to know and to know itself. And I was just curious, and like the whole theme of this project, or the scope of this project for me, is what does that manifest itself like? And like you said, I think it's an important conversation towards the future. And as we wrap up, like, you're right. Even if, whether it be this project I'm working on now, this thesis, or honors thesis, or whether it be personal journey back, if me and my brothers go, or if, you know, I talk to TT Steph and she gives us this wealth of information, what do we do with it? You know?
right.
And-
And what does it do for your life after that? It gives you a sense of knowing who you are. Does that make you who you are? It's a piece of who you are, a part of the puzzle. And luckily, you want to know that. And there's nothing wrong with that. I spent a lot of my adult life before you guys just wanted to survive.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? Living, you know, in a world that, you know, in the 90s and the 80s, life was a little different in America. You know, gang violence was running around, you know, just trying to survive and make a way. Then when you have children, you want to make sure they survive. And you don't think about, you know, the history of your family history, until you get up to a certain age, or you guys get to it, and you question, okay, well, this or that. You know, you didn't grow up with your African American grandparents.
Yeah.
I didn't travel that often to Florida to see family, the older family that was alive, like my mom's brothers and sisters while you were growing up, because we couldn't afford to do it.
Right.
You know, and they didn't travel to the West Coast. Most of them were too old to travel.
Right.
You know, and then you realize you lose, like, in the last 5 years, I've lost probably 2 of my aunts and uncles, and it's like, dang, man, I didn't get to see them in time, or you guys to meet them, because I knew who they were, because they were important in our life. My mom used to make us take bus rides to Florida at least once every 2 years to go see our cousins, fight our cousins. We'd be in the front, you know, that's how you learned who they were.
Right.
And then they would come and visit us, the ones from Minnesota, the ones from Florida. One of them lived with us, Tiffany did.
Right.
You know, so you keep that family love together, and you try to communicate. And even then, there's, you know, distance. We're all in our 50s now, but they're the source of our family history in Florida, who lived everything.
Right. And they're even closer to where the
Yes.
plantations were.
Or
Right.
let's just even say the same house where my mother grew up at.
Right.
Or where we used to go back in the 80s, early 80s, to go see my grandma. She used to do tobacco,
Right.
you know, and long hair, you know, those moo dresses.
Right.
But she was like a big mama. She cooked, slap you upside your head, braid hair, everything else,
Right.
you know, and there was a respect for it. I would like to know who her parents were.
So
You
you
know.
can start small
Yeah.
before we per se jump.
I don't even know my grandfather's name.
I didn't know that.
I know my grandmother's name because she was alive when we used to go see her before, like, and I'd only go see her like before we went to Japan, before my dad got stationed in
And
Japan.
you're talking about your paternal grandmother? Or?
Yeah, my paternal grandmother. Her name was Maddie. Yeah,
Okay.
Maddie Haywood.
Yeah.
An older black woman, real dark skinned, frail. I don't know who her husband was.
Right.
and my father's father. I know my brother. He had a brother, but I don't know if he had kids.
Right. Yeah, so when you speak earlier on the possibility that our family, at least on our paternal side, comes to you because you don't even know the other half of the tree, so to speak.
Right.
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 And yeah.
Maybe my grandmother and grandfather had brothers and sisters who had kids,
Right.
and they kept going.
Right. Yeah. Steve.
Yeah, it is.
I'll let you
But it's going to be interesting to see what comes of this project when you talk to TT Steph and you look at, what your brothers think. Or do they have a desire to know that?
Right.
Yeah. Do you guys talk about that kind
We
of stuff?
talk about it, but I mean, not too often. I think of our siblings, I probably do the most looking into it or the thought of it. Maybe it's not a priority of theirs, or obviously JoJo is very pro-black and very about it when it comes to our people. But I don't know how much. And we do talk about me, JoJo, Jay, Alex. Even though he's from Cuba. We talk about like, oh, how cool would it be to go back, maybe not stay, like go back south, but if we were to find a way to invest in Africa, what could you do with six families worth of income or investment or opportunity like that. So I know it's maybe a thought that and a conversation that we have had, but again, speaking to action, how much of that will be as we plan our lives or as our lives happen, right? And it goes along. I do feel like a certain, not accountability, but like responsibility towards the maybe our future family members, and even the ones past, with the thanks to you, the fact that I don't have to worry about just making it, right? How you said when you were growing up, then I do feel like almost a sense of duty, like since I don't have to worry about that, I can have the mental load, the emotional load, the thought process to go and invest and not invest in researching and learning about that,
Right.
and carrying that familial maybe pull, right, or that sake to in order to just to know.
Yeah. And maybe get to a point where, one of us just go ahead and take the bullet of the 23andMe and see where it comes from.
Yeah.
I might take it one of these days. Just if you want to clone me, you can just clone me. But
Right.
I think it's interesting that you want to go, that you're going to do that research, and I'm looking forward to seeing what everybody else says.
Thank you so much for watching the full interview with my dad. I had a really great time recording it and conversating with him. We have had conversations like this in the past, and I imagine we will continue having opportunities to have conversations like this in the future, that of which I look forward to. He gave me a lot to think about. It's been a few weeks since I recorded that video, and I've done some extra research, and I've done a lot of pondering on some of the topics and ideas that we've discussed, and I genuinely enjoyed the process of recording the interview and the conversation that we've had, and hopefully you were able to take something out of it, and I appreciate it again that you took the time to watch the video.